Hey, actually, I got Brandon, I got a study guide for you, and Kat is not here, so.
There.
Let me make sure you appreciate the little things in my what pads.
All right, homework. All right, what to watch for? So watch for your next homework to go up online tonight. It'll be due a week from today. So this one's going to have some Excel stuff. So remember, I always said I like having a week for the ones with Excel. So we'll have that set for a week from today. And I'm trying to kind of lay this out on how it's looking. But one of the days next week, we're probably going to do our next set of computer stuff in class, and that is correlations. So learning how to identify some of those correlations between our variables. I'll probably set the ballpark for that Monday just in case we don't finish it. I can say bring your computers back Wednesday. If that makes more sense than saying it for Wednesday, because then we have the test on Friday. So if we didn't finish it, we just kind of pushing it way back until after the test. So I think that'll be the plan. So make a note for yourself to bring your computer with you on Monday of next week. And we are getting pretty close to finishing up our part 2 of the syllabus, which is great because we are also approaching our next test date. Realistically, we may finish it kind of today, and if that's the case, we'll at least get some of the initial stuff out of the way for part 3. And I said that at the very start of the semester, that part 3 was a little longer, that it might kind of roll into this part 2 area. So we can at least start kind of getting some of the initial stuff out of the way, and that'll be fine. So we are getting kind of close to that, so if you have not caught yourself up on all the part 2 readings that are on the syllabus, please make sure that you do so. What else? One last thing, our next quiz, Friday. So we have that coming up on Friday. Okay, so when we left off, we were looking at inflation and effectively value. Right, and then I said I introduced it as a new model. I'm going to call it the value model, even though it's still just a type of money market. I just want that distinction so we know which type of money market we're using. Right, so that's going to be kind of my distinguishing factor, is that it's a value model. It's also the model that we can actually track, calculate, and show the inflation and deflation rates or whatever in society. So remember, this is the one we had built, where it's the Q of M2, still the downward sloping money demand, and we talked about that really briefly last time. We have this vertical money supply, and we have some value VM amount for society. And we talked about the idea last class, I believe, of that shift of money supply to the right effectively being, well, devaluing the currency and causing us to see inflation in society. And I think that's right where we left off. I wanted to at least briefly touch on, what about, well, again, the more recent trends of the Federal Reserve of trying to kind of decrease the money supply. And we've seen that going on. Well, as the Federal Reserve decreases the money supply, the value of the money should rise. Meaning your dollar is able to, well, to buy more stuff. So interestingly enough, I know last class we talked about this idea that, well, money supply increases should lead to inflation. Do money supply decreases then lead to deflation? We actually don't find that that is the case. So it's kind of interesting where that difference before was inflation. So instead what we find is this is kind of putting pressure on the currency to disinflate. And if you remember from when we talked about some of our data earlier on, we did say deflation is incredibly rare. but disinflation is actually fairly common. So prices still are going up, but just not as rapidly as they had been before. That's, again, kind of what we're thinking is occurring right in here. Now, I know that, you might, if you sit there and look at that and say, man, I really want inflation, deflation, that's fine, I would give it to you. If you sat there and said, well, the value's rising, that would be like currency deflating, I would give it to you. That's totally okay. In reality, that's just not what is happening. Prices are still rising, they just don't rise as rapidly. So it probably is more representative of a period of disinflation than deflation. Okay, so I kind of just wanted to put that little finishing touch on that model, and then now kind of make this transition to talk about, well, is changing the value of money bad? We had asked that question earlier in the semester anyway. Is inflation bad? And earlier when we addressed it, we kind of looked at it the very first way. We talked about it with the idea of not necessarily, because we do tend to notice that with inflation rises, there tends to be wage rise. So we said there's at least the possibility of a wash, or the possibility that wage rises faster, which would be good, or inflation rises faster, which would be bad. We then talked about it with the interest rate and the effect it has on your savings. And again, in this case, well, we've been saving at negative real interest rates for your entire life. So, well, maybe inflation's a little bad here. I want to expand that question now, is inflation bad as it pertains to value? And again, we kind of think about value in terms of what can you get for your money, and especially what can you get for your money over time. And if we're talking about purchases over time and kind of combining it with that idea of an interest rate from our previous model, kind of have to ask that question of, what's going to be the effect on value over time when we take into account the interest rate? Effectively, we want to think of the value of debt. Whoever's holding it, whether it's being held by a bank or whether it's being held by an individual, you put your money into a bank. So that's what we want to talk about. And the first thing to kind of at least introduce, it's actually a concept from finance. So every now and then, remember, we have to kind of steal some concepts from them, and they steal some concepts from us. And it's the rule of 72. How many of you have seen that in your finance already? Anyone? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so good. So some people have seen it. Let me give you a quick definition. Your finance instructor probably will give you a much more elaborate definition. The rule of 72 shows how long it takes to double a value on some fixed interest rate. Rule 72 shows how long it takes to double a value on some fixed interest rate. It's calculated mathematically by dividing 72 by the interest rate. So let's just hypothetically say that you have a 7% interest rate on some loan. The reason I picked 7% is because that is the approximate interest rate right now on student loans if you are getting it through the federal student loan program. Their interest rates are around 7%. So I figured that might be somewhat pertinent to you. So if you have a 7% interest rate on a loan, the balance of that loan, of what you owe, will double in approximately 72 divided by 7. 72 divided by 7 is 10.3-ish. And again, there's going to be a little bit of rounding involved because I think the actual full exact time is 10.25. So, a little bit of rounding. So again, the rule of 72 generally seems to kind of work. So every 10.3 years at a 7% interest rate, the amount of your loan doubles. So if you borrow, gracious, all these little stickers. If you borrow $20,000, and I'm just going to be loose and call it 10 years. You would owe $40,000, assuming you didn't make any other payments or anything like that, or borrow any additional. So what we want to do now is ask, well, how does value affect that? Well, if our inflation rate is greater than some expected inflation rate, meaning when the bank sits down and they make out this loan, one of the things they're taking into account is the inflation over time. Well, what if they're not right? And again, we know that because that was in our formula from last class. N is equal to R plus pi. So what if they're not right? What if the inflation rate is greater than the expected inflation rate? Well, if this is the case, the long-term value of money falls. In essence, the value of that $40,000 is less in the future. This is actually pretty bad for banks. Because whenever a bank makes any loan, $20,000, right, they take into account that expected inflation rate in your interest rate. Again, remember the formula from last class, that interest rate the bank is going to charge you is equal to R plus pi E. So they're going to take that into account. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean they're right. Again, we talked about the Federal Reserve releases these numbers in increments all the way out to 20 years, but at that 20-year period, they're not as accurate. They give you a wider range, and there's a lot more factors that could come into play. So what if they're not right? Well, if that's the case, the bank, whenever they take this amount, they know that in 10 years they're going to get $40,000 worth of capital in, which they're able to use to reinvest in some other venture. Well, if the value of money falls, in 10 years, the $40,000 that they receive isn't going to be as valuable, meaning they are not able to reinvest it into as large of a project as they thought. So this is bad for the bank. This is actually good, though, for the borrower. Just be, again, loose here. This is really good for the borrower. Because if the value of $40,000 goes down, it's going to be a little bit easier to pay off. We know that with inflation, wages rise. So if inflation is higher than expected, wage will rise more rapidly than expected. 40,000 is a fixed number. It's a set amount. You are going to pay back 40 grand. But it's a lot easier to do if your wage is moving up more rapidly. The value of that 40,000 is a little bit lessened. It's easier for you to pay it off. The reason I bring this up is because, again, I think this is somewhat pertinent to you guys. I think you guys should be rooting for a little bit of inflation. Because if you think about it, no matter what, there's going to be some drawbacks. There's going to be short-term drawbacks if we see a lot of rapid inflation right now. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit more expensive to buy stuff. Although a lot of the stuff that you buy, you're talking mere pennies. None of you have a house yet or anything like that. We're probably not even looking. but it's going to start putting a lot of pressure on wage to rise, and rise rapidly. You're taking out student loans, and you have already signed a piece of paper at some fixed interest rate that you're going to pay back. If you're a sophomore or a junior, I kind of think you want really high inflation right now, because it's going to put pressure on that first job wage to go up, 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 so that whenever you do enter the workforce, you enter at a higher starting salary, which is going to make any long-term debt you have easier to pay off. Like I said, yeah, there's a little bit of a trade-off. Things might get more expensive, but probably not things that you're going to purchase as a student. Wait, with the exception of tuition. I do not know why SLU published this information, but they did. I tore this out of their little SLU magazine that, I don't know why I get it, but it's delivered to me like every 2 months. And it talks about inflation and tuition, and it compares over a 200-year period. I'm just going to give you the highlights. Let's go back in time 200 years ago to 1818, so a little more than that. It gives you some of the prices of things like bread, 3 cents, I guess that's per loaf, milk, 8 cents per quart, and it gives you the tuition at SLU 200 years ago in 1818, the annual tuition, $48. 48 bucks. All right, let's fast forward 100 years. Now, we expect prices to rise, right? We all remember the very first CPI thing we looked at. It showed prices always went up, right? And they did rise. In 100 years, the annual tuition rate increased by 100%. It doubled. So in 1918, the tuition at SLU was $100 a year. Okay, I know this is playing really fast and loose with numbers. I understand that, but if you figure, okay, 100% increase, 100 years, it's like 1% a year, right? Okay, that's not bad. Let's fast forward now another 100 years. Oh wait, did they give us any other fun facts? Yeah, they did. What did they give us? Bread was now 10 cents and milk was now 15 cents. Okay, fair enough. And there's other things kind of mixed in here, but those are the ones that I can see in my old age without having to look like this. So let's fast forward to 2018. Did we go up another 100%? That would have gotten us to $200. No. Instead, tuition is $41,540. We can figure out that inflation rate. Remember, in the first 100 years of SLU's existence, tuition went up 50 bucks. In the second 100 years of SLU's bicentennial celebration we just had, right, tuition went up $41,440. If you like, you can probably see the bar graph. You won't even be able to see the other years. They're little dashes down here at the bottom. This is SLU's inflation rate. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So maybe there is a little bit of bad for you if it also pushes that tuition price up, but I think for the most part, like I said, especially if you're a sophomore or a junior in this class, you want to root for some inflation. You just don't buy enough now to be really, really negatively impacted by higher prices. 20% inflation would probably be great for you right now. Yeah, it would suck. You know, you'd have to pay a little bit more for gas, a little bit more for beer, but what else do you buy? You know what I mean? And what would 20% inflation mean for 2 years? It would mean that first job you're getting when you're graduating is several $1,000s higher annually than it is right now, which would make any debt that you're incurring actually pretty darn easy to pay off. So I think you should root for a little bit of inflation. 20% might be a little high, but you know, whatever. By the way, just like everything else literally we've ever looked at ever, all of this can work in reverse as well. Right? Well, what if, because again, they're kind of guessing, What if the actual inflation rate is less than the expected inflation rate? In this case, the long-term value of money rises. Banks planned on there being, well, a lot of inflation. So they planned on taking, calculating that in, giving you a higher interest rate, and getting some amount back. Well, there wasn't as much inflation. Guess what? The bank still gets that fixed amount of money back. You guys signed it, you agreed to an interest rate, the nominal interest rate thought the inflation rate was going to be high, and it wasn't. Well, you still have to pay it. In this case, the bank gets effectively extra value out of that loan. This is good for the bank. Oh, that's kind of weird looking. That's all right, sorry. They get more out of their loan than they thought. This also tends to be a bad time for borrowers. So this is good for a bank. This is a bad time for borrowers because in situations like this, this is kind of what we've seen in the past decade. The Federal Reserve expected inflation. They were trying to make inflation around that 2 to 2.5, and it just hasn't been there. It's been about between 1.5 and 2. So it's been just below, but it's been below nonetheless. Even in an expansion, we're not seeing, until recently, until the last year, we're not seeing really rapid wage growth. It kind of stalled out. Wages, they just didn't grow like they had historically in the history of the United States. Again, if you take the entire history of the United States, you kind of have to get some messy averages and 2 time periods when women entered the workforce, and then in the 80s when we saw a lot of corporate expansion. But if you kind of just take a messy average, wages grow about 3%, and we haven't been there. We've also been experiencing this. So we've seen some really slow wage growth, even though you still owe the same amount of money. It means that more and more and more of your weekly paycheck actually goes to paying things like the long-term debt, mortgages, student loans, etc. So a higher percent of your paycheck is sucked up by these long-term debts. So it's kind of bad for our borrowers in this case. So it's kind of interesting just to take another look at, is inflation bad? I guess it kind of depends on if you hold debt or not. Because if you owe somebody money, well, it might be good to have a little inflation. If you are the holder of debt, meaning someone owes you money, you might be rooting for a little bit of that less than kind of inflation based on that loan. I think this is also something that we can kind of take into account that's kind of neat. So one of the things you guys talked about in your early semester stuff, and we've been working in some of your early semester things, if you remember. We haven't worked in cooking and food, and I said that probably wouldn't happen. But one of the things you guys thought was kind of interesting was movies. And I said, I don't know how that's going to work in macro. We have Macroeconomics, the movie. But there actually is something we can talk about. There is actually a movie of this exact thing right here. And my guess, I bet probably all of you have seen it, or at least, 3/4 of the room, I'm sure, has seen this movie. A movie solely about macroeconomics, totally about monetary policy. The whole movie was all monetary policy. Right, y'all? Do you know what I'm talking about? I know you've seen it. No, you're like, I've never watched a movie on monetary policy because that would be horribly boring. I think you have. From my perspective, it was still horribly boring. I hate this movie. Kind of weird because it is about economics. The Wizard of Oz. How many of you have seen it? Look, see, I said like everyone has seen it. It is. The Wizard of Oz is a movie based on economic policy. from start to finish. And like I said, you would think that because it's about so much economics, I would totally love that movie. I don't. I think it is one of the worst movies ever made. I got to be honest. It's so horrible. But that's an aside. So let's talk about this really quick. Do a quick kind of case study here. So first of all, I hope, I'm not sure, but I hope that you all know that the movie The Wizard of Oz is based on a book called The Wizard of Oz. The person who wrote that book is named Frank Baum. Yes, have we heard of the book, or at least heard of the author, or at least the book? Okay, so Frank Baum. So if I had to say, hey, guess what his occupation was, guess what his job was, I'm guessing all of you would be like, children's author, because The Wizard of Oz is a kind of a young book. I think most schools now read it in 5th grade or something around that ballpark. And if you said children's author, or even if you just said author in general, you'd be wrong. That was not his job. Frank Baum was the political columnist for the Chicago Sun newspaper. So, newspaper up in Chicago, and he was the political columnist in the early 1900s. That's what his job was. He covered politics for the Chicago Sun. I think it's now called the Chicago Sun-Times, right? 2 papers merged. Yeah, so it was the Chicago Sun. So first of all, let me give you a little bit of background. In the early 1900s, when he was writing for this paper, Chicago was not the sprawling metropolis it is today. In fact, St. Louis was the larger city. It was much bigger than Chicago. Chicago was small, and it was primarily rural. Most of the readers of the Chicago newspaper were rural families, meaning agriculture dominated the Chicago economy. Lots of farms, and you don't have to go too far out of Chicago, even still today, to get into farms, right? You go 45 minutes down 55, and you're like, what happened to population? Because there's nothing. It's just farms, right? So imagine that, but all the way up to the city limits of Chicago. So most of the people he wrote to were farmers. What was going on in the economy? Well, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the United States was experiencing significant deflation. Not just year to year, but within any given year. So we'd have deflation from March until September, a significant amount. If we kind of look at this, and say, well, where would deflation fall here? Well, it kind of falls here. Good for banks, bad for borrowers. We actually saw that especially true in the agricultural industry. Farmers were hit really hard by this deflation. Farming, and actually this is still very true today. So in the spring, a lot of farmers, they don't have a lot of money, right? Because all winter you could grow nothing. So in the spring, it's very common, even today, for farmers to go and take out loans to buy all of the products they need, the seeds, the fertilizer, etc. They typically take out a short-term loan, 6-month loan, because 6 months after you plant the seed, you can harvest your crop and sell the product and have money pay off the loan and live off the profits through the winter. Like I said, that's actually still not uncommon today. So what was happening in this time period is, you get to about February, March, April, whenever, and our farmers were going to banks and taking out significant loans so they could plant their fields. And they'd plant their fields, summer would go, they'd grow their crops, and then it gets to September and it's time to sell them, and we experienced severe deflation within that year, which means the value of the crop that they're selling has become significantly less, to the point where it was less valuable in some cases than the seed that they had purchased initially. Because of this, a lot of our farmers were not fully able to pay off their loans. Now you might say, well, how is this good for the banks? Well, most of the farmers put their land up as collateral, which meant that the banks would go and the farmer would come in and say, I can only pay you 80%. The bank would say, okay, that's okay, we'll take 20% of your, of it in your land. And banks started really, really, really quickly acquiring a lot of land in and around Chicago. And the farmers every year had smaller and smaller amounts of land, which means smaller and smaller amounts of profit for them and a much more difficult life. So that was a little bit kind of the backstory. Banks, by the way, were very commonly selling them to industrialists at the time. We were starting to see that kind of that industrial revolution expand out of just the Northeast. So banks were selling that land off to industrialists. So Frank Baum started writing about this, and he started elaborating on this as a byproduct of the monetary policy of the day. In the early 1900s, very different than today, it was considered a major faux pas to speak negatively of any politician in the press. Right? Today, no, we don't care, we'll tweet out whatever we want, doesn't matter. In the early 1900s, you just didn't do it. You did not call politicians out in the press. So instead of calling out politicians, he made up a story, kind of like a weekly column. And in the weekly column, there were all these characters that at the time were very clearly identifiable as to different segments of the population, the people, or to politicians. So some of the characters in the story, well, some of them you know. Dorothy, right? Dorothy represented this all-American girl, hardworking, virtuous, was somewhat interested in politics but could tell something was wrong. The Cowardly Lion. The Cowardly Lion was meant to be William Jennings Bryan. So his nickname at the time was the Lion because in Congress he gave these huge, fiery speeches. So people called him the Lion. But then it became the Cowardly Lion because he spoke out against the U.S. war with Spain and Mexico for the territories of like Texas, New Mexico, etc. So whenever he had this character of a cowardly lion, even though he described him as an animal, everyone knew who he was talking about. The Scarecrow represented the American farmer. I don't think there's a big leap there that I need to take. You guys probably got that one. But think about this. What was the problem with the Scarecrow in the movie, and actually in the book too, and the newspaper column? The problem with the Scarecrow in the movie was he didn't have a brain. He kept making these stupid decisions over and over and over and over. Like borrowing money that you knew you couldn't pay off. The Tin Man represented the industrial worker, the American industrial worker. What was the Tin Man's problem? He had no heart. Putting these farmers out of work to buy land, buying their land from the banks to build some kind of factory or some kind of industrial center. We had the Munchkins that represented the poor and tired masses, especially in the East Coast. The Wizard. The Wizard represented the president. That there was this belief that he had some power to control the economy, but in practicality, that power was illusionary. Even if you think about some of the other kind of things, the Yellow Brick Road, if you kind of think about Yellow Brick Road was meant to represent gold. At the time, the United States used the commodity standard. And the only commodity that backed currency was the gold standard. In fact, even Oz, O-Z, is the abbreviation for an ounce of gold. So we've got kind of this elaborate setup now, this backstory. What was Baum saying? Well, he was arguing against the current monetary policy of backing the US dollar with gold. And he was consistently in his articles, in his writings, beyond just the story element, talking about changing how US currency was backed. The movie lost this part. The book kept it. In the movie, how did the happy ending occur? She what?
She goes home.
She goes home, but how'd she get there? She didn't catch the hot air balloon with the wizard, remember? How'd she get back home? She clicked her heels together 3 times. What heels? They're in the Smithsonian, right? What was she wearing? Red ruby slippers. There's no red ruby slippers in the book. Keep in mind, before Wizard of Oz, movies were all in black and white. And what did they want to do? They wanted to show off Technicolor. This amazing ability to capture movies in color, and what does it better than bright, sparkling, red ruby slippers? Well, that was a change from the book, from the newspaper articles. In the book and the newspaper articles, Dorothy's slippers were silver. They didn't want that for the movie because silver looks like black and white. That's not special. Dorothy's slippers were silver. And in Baum's writing, the happy ending came when Dorothy used her silver slippers. Following the yellow brick road, following gold was not enough. She had to rely on silver. Frank Baum was a huge proponent of adding silver as a commodity to back the U.S. money supply. Think about what would happen if that occurred. Right, there's a fixed amount of gold that you've got to base money. If all of a sudden you add all the silver in the United States, which is it's a very plentiful material, it's like adding a ton of money into society. It's kind of the 1900 version of quantitative easing. It's how can we take a bunch of money and dump it into society? Well, if we had something else that backed it. Now, what would that do? It would create a lot of inflation really quickly, counteracting all the deflation that was hurting his readers, his constituency, his farmers. It would get us into this situation. High levels of inflation, good for the borrower. So when Frank Baum wrote Wizard of Oz, he wasn't writing a kid's story. He was telling a tale of monetary policy. And his recommendation of, well, what should be done in terms of monetary standards. So that just might have ruined the movie for you. And if it did, I'm sorry, but at least then we're on even footing. Now none of us like it. You know what really did it? This is an aside. You don't need this in your notes. You know what really did it to me is I just thought the ending was so stupid. After 2 hours of getting chased by witches and monkey, they go, oh, all you have to do is click your heels together. I'd be so pissed. Because you could have done that at the start of the movie. So, yeah, that part made me really mad. I always kind of I wanted Dorothy to smack the crap out of the witch at that point. and just for all the stuff that she put her through and be like, just start demanding a flight out immediately. That would have made the movie a lot better. I think I might have actually liked it then, but that didn't happen. Instead, she was just super happy and whatever. All right, so kind of interesting, kind of fun, and look, see, we tied movies into it. Awesome. All right, so we will on Friday. This is very little time at all. So this won't take long, which means we will probably go into some of the setup definitions for our next section. I won't go ahead and probably assign a full reading. We're just going to start knocking out some of the setup. Then on Monday we'll have computers, and we'll see how long that takes us, and I'll plan Wednesday when we get through Monday. Hey, stick around. I want to see your book online again. Okay, because I've asked